Imagine calling Donald Trump's office in 1991, expecting to speak with Donald Trump. Instead, a man answers. He says his name is John Miller. He claims to be Trump's publicist. And then he starts telling you things that sound almost too perfect. Trump is successful. Trump is popular. Women want him. Celebrities want to date him. And this supposed spokesman knows an astonishing amount about Trump's private life. There is only one problem. According to journalists and former Trump associates interviewed decades later, John Miller was not a separate publicist at all. The voice on the recording sounded like Donald Trump. The Washington Post reported that the man using the name was Trump himself. This was not a presidential press secretary. There was no White House, no campaign podium, no national political movement. There was just a young New York developer trying to control the story around his own name. And that makes this story much bigger than one strange phone call. The real question is not simply why Donald Trump pretended to be John Miller. The more revealing question is this. Why would a powerful businessman feel the need to create another person just to praise himself? And what does that tell us about the media strategy that followed? The answer begins in New York. Long before Trump became a political figure, he understood something important about attention. Being famous was not enough. You had to remain in the story. In 1980s Manhattan, the story machine was enormous. Newspapers competed for readers. Tabloids competed for gossip. Television wanted personalities. Magazine writers wanted access. And Trump wanted all of it. The relationship was mutually useful. Reporters needed colorful stories. Trump needed publicity. The difference was that Trump did not simply wait for reporters to find him. According to accounts from journalists who covered him, he actively cultivated them. Sometimes under his own name, and sometimes, according to those accounts, under another. One of those names was John Barron. Another was John Miller. These names could appear to belong to independent people, representatives, executives, or spokesmen, but according to reporting by the Washington Post, the people behind those identities included Trump himself. The practice appears to go back decades. The Post reported that the name John Barron appeared in a New York Times report as early as June 1980, involving Trump and a controversial decision concerning Art Deco sculptures. Trump had conditionally promised the sculptures to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, then decided to destroy them. When reporters tried to reach him, a man identified as John Barron reportedly became part of the process. According to the Post, Trump later spoke to the Times himself. The story was strange. The identity was stranger, because John Barron, according to later reporting, was Trump. This was not necessarily about hiding from attention. Sometimes it appears to have been about shaping it. That distinction matters. Most people imagine a publicist as someone standing between a celebrity and the press, protecting the client, managing access, choosing what information gets released, speaking on the client's behalf. But imagine the client becoming the publicist. Suddenly there is no distance between the message and the person receiving it. No skeptical intermediary. No communications director saying, maybe we should not say that. The person creating the image is the person selling the image, and the person being sold is himself. That is what makes the John Miller episode so revealing. In 1991, People magazine reporter Sue Carswell was working on a story involving Trump's personal life. His marriage to Ivana Trump was ending. His relationship with Marla Maples was attracting attention. His name was already appearing regularly in New York gossip coverage. Carswell contacted Trump's office looking for Trump. Instead, she received a call from someone identifying himself as John Miller. According to the Washington Post, the call came within minutes. Miller did not sound like a reluctant publicist. He sounded eager. He offered detailed information about Trump's relationships, discussed Trump's romantic life, talked about Trump's celebrity connections, and portrayed Trump as successful and desirable. Most importantly, he presented the praise as if it were coming from someone else. That is the genius of the setup. If Trump says, "I am extremely successful," everyone knows the statement is self-promotion. If a supposedly independent spokesman says it, the statement can sound like information. If Trump says, "Women are constantly interested in me," it sounds like boasting. If a spokesman says it, a reporter might treat it as background. The same message suddenly appears to come from a different source, and that changes how the audience receives it. The 1991 recording is what turned this from an old rumor into a much more tangible story. The Washington Post obtained the recording and published a transcript. The voice was immediately recognizable to people familiar with Trump. The Post described the tone as confident and the cadence as distinctly Trumpian. But voice recognition alone is not the entire story. Trump denied that he was John Miller. That denial matters. It is important to distinguish between what was documented and what was disputed. Existon had identified himself as John Miller. The Washington Post reported that journalists and former Trump associates identified the voice as Trump. Trump denied being the person on the recording. So the careful conclusion is not that every detail was independently proven in a courtroom. The careful conclusion is that the Washington Post published the recording, investigated the identity, and reported that Miller was Trump based on interviews with journalists and former associates. There was also another important piece of history. Trump had previously acknowledged using the name John Miller, and he had acknowledged using John Barron as an alias. That makes the story harder to dismiss as a completely invented narrative. But there is still a deeper mystery. Why go through the trouble? Why not simply have a real publicist make the call? Why pretend to be another person? Why create a character whose job was essentially to make Donald Trump sound more impressive? To understand that, you have to understand the world Trump was building. In the 1980s, Trump was becoming a recognizable figure in New York. Trump Tower became a symbol of his ambitions. His casinos expanded his public profile. His name appeared in newspapers, magazines, television reports, and gossip columns. He was becoming more than a businessman. He was becoming a brand. And a brand requires repetition. It needs a consistent story, recognizable symbols, and a narrative that people can repeat. Trump understood the power of that narrative unusually early. His image was not simply real estate developer. It was bigger. He wanted to be associated with wealth, luxury, power, celebrity, beautiful women, successful deals, famous friends, and extraordinary confidence. The media helped build that image. But the relationship worked both ways. Trump gave journalists material. Journalists gave Trump attention. Attention made Trump more recognizable. Recognition created more curiosity. More curiosity generated more coverage. More coverage made him even harder to ignore. It became a feedback loop, and Trump was unusually good at feeding it. That is why the John Miller story is not merely a bizarre anecdote. It is a tiny window into a much larger media strategy. The fake spokesman allowed Trump to participate in the story while pretending to stand outside it. Think about how powerful that can be. A celebrity says something about himself. Readers know the celebrity has an incentive to exaggerate, but a supposedly independent spokesman feels different. The information appears to have a source. It sounds like insider knowledge. It sounds like someone close to the celebrity is explaining what is really happening. And that is exactly the role Miller played in the 1991 conversation. He was not simply saying Trump was rich. He was explaining Trump, interpreting Trump, defending Trump, selling Trump. In other words, he was doing what a publicist does, except the person promoting Trump was allegedly Trump. And the subject of the promotion did not have to admit he was promoting himself. That is a fascinating communications trick. It is also a warning about the power of media narratives. Once a story enters the press, the original source can disappear. A reporter writes a sentence. An editor publishes it. Another publication repeats it. A television host discusses it. A reader remembers it. Soon the original claim becomes part of the public image. The audience may never know where it started. And Trump understood that ecosystem. One of the most revealing examples came from journalist Jonathan Greenberg. In 1984, Greenberg was working on Forbes' early wealth rankings. Trump spoke with him using the name John Barron. According to Greenberg's later account, Trump provided information designed to make himself appear wealthier and more prominent. The story became significant because the Forbes list carried enormous prestige. Being included was not merely a number on a page. It was a status symbol that helped define who America considered wealthy and powerful. Appearing on the list could reinforce the exact image Trump was trying to create. The Washington Post later reported on Greenberg's account and described the broader strategy as a pattern of self-promotion. The important point is not simply that Trump wanted publicity. Lots of ambitious people want publicity. The unusual part was the method. He was not merely trying to get attention. He was trying to influence the information environment around himself. And sometimes, according to the reporting, he did that through an assumed identity. That raises an uncomfortable question. What happens when a person becomes both the subject and the source of the story? The answer is that the boundary between reality and public image becomes harder to see. And that boundary was already becoming central to Trump's career. He did not have to convince everyone of everything. He only needed to create an impression strong enough to survive repetition. A public image does not require every detail to be true. It requires enough people to believe the overall story. The story becomes the product. And Trump was selling a story about Donald Trump, a man who always wins, who attracts attention, who lives among celebrities, who supposedly operates at a level ordinary people cannot reach. The John Miller call fits neatly into that larger narrative. But there's another reason the recording became so memorable. Listen to what the supposed spokesman was talking about. It was not a boring corporate statement. It was Trump's romantic life, his relationships, his popularity with women, his celebrity connections. The details were exactly the kind of material that could attract tabloid attention. And tabloid culture mattered enormously in New York. The city's gossip pages could turn a businessman into a celebrity into a character, and a private relationship into public entertainment. Trump understood the value of that attention. The Washington Post later reported that he developed relationships with individual tabloid writers and used those relationships to shape coverage. Again, the important point is not that Trump alone invented this behavior. Politicians, celebrities, executives, and public figures have always cultivated the press. The difference was the intensity. Trump appeared to treat media attention as an asset that could be actively managed. And John Miller was one of the strangest tools in that system. Imagine the confidence required. You call a journalist, you change your name, you change your role, then you start talking about yourself in the third person. You describe your own popularity. You explain your own romantic decisions. You praise your own personality. And you trust that the journalist will not immediately recognize you. That sounds almost like a comedy sketch, except there was a real journalist on the other end, a real recording, and a real publication deadline. That is what makes the episode so extraordinary. The bizarre thing is that it apparently worked, at least for a while. Reporters who received calls from John Barron or John Miller sometimes treated them as genuine Trump representatives. The Post reported that the names appeared in published accounts over a period of years. Some journalists later said the calls were disturbing. Others viewed them as playful. But either way, the calls became part of the machinery surrounding Trump, and this is where the story becomes much more relevant to the modern media environment. Today, the media landscape is even more fragmented. Television networks, cable channels, podcasts, YouTube, social media, influencers, political commentators, private newsletters, millions of posts every day. A public figure no longer needs to wait for a newspaper editor to decide whether he deserves coverage. He can generate the story directly. Trump became one of the most effective political users of that reality. But the instinct did not begin in politics. The instinct was already visible decades earlier. Control the narrative, generate attention, keep your name circulating, make yourself part of the conversation, and when possible, shape how people interpret the conversation. That does not mean every later political tactic was directly copied from John Miller. There is no evidence proving such a simple one-to-one connection. But the continuity in media instinct is difficult to ignore. The businessman and the politician both understood the value of attention, the power of repetition, and the fact that controversy could create coverage. Both operated in an environment where being ignored could be more dangerous than being criticized. That is the larger lesson. Trump did not need every headline to praise him. He needed headlines. Negative coverage still put his name in front of people. Positive coverage strengthened his image. Arguments created attention. Attention created familiarity. And familiarity can become political power. But before Trump became a presidential candidate, there was another critical transformation. He stopped being merely a businessman who received coverage. He became someone people expected to hear from. Once audiences recognize a person, journalists know that mentioning him can attract attention. That makes the person more newsworthy. Newsworthiness generates more coverage. Coverage increases recognition. Again, the loop continues, and the person at the center of the loop gains enormous cultural power. The John Miller episode shows how aggressively Trump was willing to participate in that process. There's something almost psychological about it. A person who is already famous still wants an outside voice saying he is famous. A wealthy man wants someone else to explain how wealthy he is. A celebrity wants someone else to explain why celebrities want him. Why? Maybe it was control. Maybe it was ego. Maybe it was simply a publicity tactic. The available evidence cannot tell us exactly what was happening inside Trump's mind. We should not pretend it can, but we can observe the behavior. And the behavior is extraordinary. Trump was willing, according to the reporting, to create fictional representatives who could speak on his behalf. That tells us something about how seriously he took the construction of his public identity. He was not just living a public life. He was managing a character. And the character was Donald Trump. This is where the story takes another turn. In 2016, when the Washington Post published the recording, Trump was no longer simply a New York developer. He was running for president. The recording suddenly became politically relevant. The question was no longer just whether a businessman had once used a fake spokesman. Now voters were asking what the episode revealed about his character. Trump denied being John Miller. He also pushed back publicly against the idea that the voice was his. But the controversy did not disappear. The recording was there, the transcript was there. Journalists who had encountered the alleged aliases were available to discuss their experiences. And Trump's previous statements about using aliases complicated the denial.
It required a fundamental shift in how we approach the issue,
Trump acknowledged that he had used aliases in his real estate dealings. He explained that sometimes he did so because people might charge more if they knew they were dealing with Trump. That explanation is important because it demonstrates that alias use itself was not imaginary. Trump openly acknowledged using aliases in certain circumstances. The disputed question was whether he was the person speaking as John Miller on the 1991 recording. That distinction should remain clear. Accuracy matters precisely because the story is already dramatic enough. There is no need to exaggerate it. The facts are strange on their own. A famous businessman had used assumed names. One of those names appeared in media reports. A 1991 recording captured a supposed publicist named John Miller discussing Trump. The voice sounded like Trump. Journalists and former associates told the Washington Post that Miller was Trump. Trump denied that identification. And years earlier, Trump had acknowledged using the name John Miller and the name John Barron in different contexts. That is the documented controversy. Everything beyond that needs caution. But the broader pattern is still fascinating, because this was not simply about hiding identity. It was about manufacturing authority. John Miller sounded like an insider. He appeared to have access. He appeared to know Trump personally. He appeared to understand Trump's decisions. And because he supposedly worked for Trump, his praise could sound like information. That is the psychological trick. The messenger changes the meaning of the message. If Trump says, "People love me," the audience hears self-praise. If John Miller says, "People love Trump," the audience may hear testimony. The words are similar. The perceived source is different. And perceived sources are one of the most powerful forces in media. We trust information differently depending on who we believe is speaking. That is true today. It was true in 1991. And it was true in 1980. The technology changed. The psychology did not. This is why the John Miller story deserves to be remembered beyond its entertainment value. It shows an early version of something modern audiences now recognize instantly. The battle for public perception is not only about what you say. It is about who appears to be saying it. Trump's alleged alter egos created the appearance of independent validation. And independent validation is powerful. It can make a claim feel less like advertising. It can make a boast feel like reporting. It can make a carefully constructed image feel spontaneous. That may be the most important insight hidden inside this strange story. Trump did not simply want to tell people who he was. He wanted the world to repeat the story. And sometimes, according to the reporting, he helped create the voices doing the repeating. Think about how unusual that is. Most people trying to build a reputation hire someone else to promote them. Trump allegedly became the promoter. He became the source. He became the spokesman. He became the story. And then he became the person watching the story spread. That is an unusually complete media feedback loop. It also explains why the story still feels relevant. We live in a world where public figures can speak directly to millions. They can post statements without editors. They can respond instantly. They can attack coverage they dislike. They can amplify favorable stories. They can create controversies that dominate an entire news cycle. Trump became exceptionally skilled at this environment. But the instinct was visible long before social media. The tools were telephones, newspapers, gossip columns, and personal relationships. The objective was remarkably familiar. Get attention, keep attention, control the narrative, and make the name impossible to ignore. There's another detail worth considering. The John Miller call happened during a period when Trump's personal life was already receiving intense media attention. His marriage to Ivana was ending. His relationship with Marla Maples was being covered. He was being discussed as a wealthy businessman and celebrity figure. In that environment, a call from a supposedly knowledgeable spokesman could provide exactly the kind of material a reporter needed. And that is what happened. Carswell was not calling for a lecture about real estate. She was reporting on Trump's personal life. Miller understood the subject, or more precisely, the person behind Miller understood it extremely well. He knew the narrative, he knew the personalities, he knew what would sound interesting, and he knew what image of Trump the story could reinforce. That is what makes the conversation so revealing. The supposed spokesman did not merely defend Trump, he helped construct the character of Trump, a successful man, a desirable man, a man surrounded by famous women, a man whose relationship supposedly reflected his extraordinary status. Whether every boast was true is a separate question. The important point is that this was the image being promoted, and image can become reality in the public imagination. Once enough people hear the same story, the story can begin to feel established. That is how myths form. Not necessarily through one enormous lie, but sometimes through thousands of small repetitions. A quote here, a headline there, a television segment, a magazine profile, a whispered tip, a flattering anecdote, a mysterious insider. Then another article repeats it, then another. Eventually the person becomes larger than the original facts. That process is especially powerful when the subject is willing to participate constantly. Trump was. The Washington Post's later reporting described him as a figure who relentlessly thrust himself into the press. That phrase captures the larger pattern. He did not simply wait to become famous. He actively pursued visibility, and the John Miller persona was one extreme example of that pursuit. Most people don't realize how early this media instinct appeared. Trump's political career can make it seem like his relationship with the media began when he started campaigning. It did not. By the time he entered presidential politics, he had already spent decades learning how journalists work. He knew what kinds of stories attracted attention. He knew the value of conflict. He knew the value of celebrity. He knew the power of a memorable quote. And he knew that his name itself could become a headline. That was a tremendous advantage. Politics later gave him a much larger stage. But the performance had been rehearsed for years, not necessarily as a secret master plan. There was no evidence that a young Trump was sitting in a Manhattan office planning a future presidential campaign around a fake spokesman. That would be speculation. The more defensible interpretation is simpler. He was a highly ambitious businessman who understood publicity. He experimented with ways to influence coverage. Some of those methods were conventional, some were unconventional, and some were bizarre enough to become part of his legend decades later. John Miller belongs in that last category. The story also reveals something about journalism itself. Reporters operate under pressure. They need information, they need quotes, they need access, they compete with other reporters, and sources can be incredibly valuable. A supposedly knowledgeable spokesman can make a reporter's job easier. But that convenience creates risk. If the source is not who he claims to be, the entire structure collapses. The source is no longer independent. The information may be self-serving, and the reporter may unknowingly become part of someone else's publicity strategy. That is why verification matters. It always has. The John Miller controversy is almost a case study in what happens when a source's identity becomes the story. It also demonstrates why old recordings can suddenly become politically explosive. For years, the 1991 tape was simply an old piece of media history. Then in 2016, it became relevant again. The person on the tape was now seeking the presidency. The old voice suddenly had new stakes. What might once have been dismissed as a strange publicity stunt became evidence people debated as part of a candidate's character. That is how history works. Old behavior can acquire new meaning when circumstances change. The recording itself did not change. Trump's position changed. The audience changed. The stakes changed. And suddenly, a decades-old phone call mattered. That is one reason journalists keep archives. Because yesterday's curiosity can become tomorrow's evidence. And sometimes the most revealing stories about powerful people are buried in ordinary moments. Not speeches, not elections, not scandals. A phone call, a name, a voice, a reporter taking notes, a man talking about himself while pretending not to be himself. That is the entire strange architecture of John Miller. And maybe the most fascinating part is how little technology was required. No social media, no bots, no deepfakes, no artificial intelligence. Just a telephone, a journalist, and a carefully chosen name. The tools were primitive. The strategy was not. The strategy was to create a voice that could carry the message without carrying the obvious appearance of self-interest. And that is still one of the central problems in modern information. Who is speaking? Why are they speaking? Who benefits if you believe them? And is the person presenting the information actually independent from the person being promoted? Those questions matter far beyond Trump. They matter whenever a powerful person controls the narrative surrounding himself. They matter whenever a company creates supposedly independent praise. They matter whenever political campaigns flood the information environment with favorable voices. They matter whenever an anonymous source appears to know exactly what a public figure wants people to believe. And they matter because audiences rarely see the entire machinery behind a story. We see the headline, we hear the quote, we watch the clip, but we do not always see who created the opportunity for that information to exist. The John Miller episode pulls back that curtain. It shows a public figure participating directly in his own mythology. And whether you admire Trump or despise him, that part of the story is difficult to ignore. Because the tactic reveals an obsession with perception. Not simply success, but perceived success. Not simply fame, but perceived fame. Not simply wealth, but perceived wealth. And not simply influence, but the appearance of influence. That distinction became enormously important in Trump's career. He built a public identity around winning. He wanted people to believe he was the person who always knew the right move, the person everyone wanted to meet, the person everyone wanted to do business with, the person everyone was talking about. And sometimes, according to the reporting, he helped create those impressions himself, through his own voice, under someone else's name. That is the strange irony. The man who became famous for being unapologetically himself once spent years pretending to be someone else, not to disappear, but to become more visible, not to escape publicity, but to manufacture it, not to stop people talking about Donald Trump, but to give them another reason to talk. And perhaps that is why John Miller is more than an amusing footnote. He's a glimpse into the mechanics of celebrity. He shows how a public identity can be deliberately constructed. He shows how media attention can become a form of power. And he shows how the line between publicity and performance can become incredibly thin. The young Trump did not have a presidential campaign operation. He did not have a massive political communications team. He did not have millions of social media followers. Yet he was already experimenting with a fundamental problem every major public figure faces. How do you control a story that other people are telling about you? His answer, at least in part, appears to have been extraordinary. Sometimes become the person telling the story. Just don't tell them you're Donald Trump. Decades later, the recording surfaced again. The voice was debated. The identity was disputed. The old aliases were examined. And the past suddenly became part of a presidential campaign. But the larger lesson survived all of that controversy. Trump had spent years learning that attention is power. He learned that a headline can be valuable. He learned that a flattering story can reinforce a brand. He learned that controversy can keep a name in circulation. And he learned that the messenger can matter as much as the message. John Miller was perhaps the strangest expression of that lesson. A fictional publicist, a supposedly independent voice, a person who could praise Trump without appearing to be Trump. And if the Washington Post reporting is correct, that voice was Trump himself. So the next time you hear a powerful person praised by an unnamed insider, ask a simple question. Who benefits from this story? Who is really speaking? And how much of the public image was built by the person at the center of it? Because the strangest thing about the John Miller story is not that Donald Trump allegedly pretended to be his own spokesman. It is that he understood something about media attention that remains true today. You do not always need people to believe everything you say. Sometimes you just need them to keep saying your name. And Trump mastered that long before he ever entered the White House. So what do you think? Was John Miller simply an outrageous publicity stunt from another era? Or was it an early glimpse of the media strategy that would eventually help make Donald Trump one of the most recognizable political figures in America? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you want more deeply researched stories about the hidden moments behind powerful people, subscribe.